Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Supremely Enlightened One. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Supremely Enlightened One. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Supremely Enlightened One. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Namo Buddhaya. So today I wanted to kind of change the way we've been doing the sutta class. Today I'd like to have more of an active discussion with everyone. So I will teach a discourse, and along the way, I think it would be helpful to ask questions from all of you. And I think that would improve, because this is a fairly deep discourse today. So I think this would help to improve and polish your own knowledge of the Dhamma, and it'd give you an opportunity to also ask questions about this deep discourse. So today's discourse is found in the Samyutta Nikaya. It is the first discourse in the Kanda Samyutta on Nakulapita. So maybe if someone could send an internet link. I'm using Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. It's Nakulapita, the first discourse in the Kanda Samyutta of the Samyutta Nikaya. Now, before we begin the actual discourse, I thought it would be appropriate just to speak a little bit about so the state of the world as it is these days. So we're in the midst of a pandemic that's almost approaching 2 years continuously. So people are continuously dying in the world. Millions of people have been infected, right? And the virus is mutating so that it can become resistant to vaccines and so on. So even people who've been vaccinated can be infected with the Delta variant of the virus. So it's important to understand that. It's important to understand that all of you could get the virus. That's a possibility, right? And so because of that, we should prepare ourselves. We may get it, we may not get it, but we should prepare ourselves mentally for that. So along those lines, this discourse speaks about bodily sickness and mental sickness. So there are two different things in the Buddha's teachings: to become bodily ill and to be mentally ill. You understand? So let's begin the discourse. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling among the Bhaggas at Sumsumaragira in the Bhesakala Grove, the deer park. Then the householder, Nakulapita, approached the Blessed One, paid homage to him, sat down to one side, and said to him, I am old, Venerable Sir, aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, come to the last stage, afflicted in body, often ill. So this is what happens when we grow old, right? When a person grows old, they spend a lot of time just going on doctor visits. They take a lot of medication, right? Just to keep the body functioning at a relatively sick state, right? So this is the nature of the body. And when we all grow old, we will have to experience this. I rarely get to see the Blessed One, and the monks worthy of esteem. So since he's old and sick, it's difficult for him to travel to the monastery. Difficult to go to the monastery. So the Buddha would live in forests, right? Outside of the city. So it's difficult for him to travel there and speak with the Buddha, to hear discourses from monks. Let the Blessed One exhort me, Venerable Sir. Let him instruct me, since that would lead to my welfare and happiness for a long time. So we can see the household of Nakulapita. So he's gone for refuge to the Buddha, to the Dhamma and the Sangha, right? So he sees the triple gem as a place of security in his life. So even though he's sick and old, he sees the Buddha as a source of protection for him. So he can visit the Buddha and learn the Dhamma from the Buddha, and that will lead to his happiness. So that's what he's thinking. Being sick and old, he's not thinking about like the state of his household affairs. what will happen if he? So what will happen when he passes away? So he's thinking about how the Buddha can teach in the Dhamma. Buddha replies, "So it is, householder, so it is. This body of yours is afflicted, weighed down, encumbered. If anyone carrying around this body were to claim to be healthy, even for a moment, what is that due to other than foolishness?" So the nature of the body is to become sick. Right? The nature of the body is to grow old. So these days, the body very readily accepts the coronavirus, right? No matter how much we might like otherwise, the body is ready to accept the virus, ready to contract the virus, ready to become sick, because that's the body's nature. So to claim to be healthy when a person has such a body, and the body is subject to aging, sickness, all sorts of diseases, as foolishness, the Buddha says. Therefore, householder, you should train yourself thus. Even though I am afflicted in body, my mind will be unafflicted. Thus should you train yourself. So here the Buddha is saying, even though you get sick in body, even though your body falls ill, you shouldn't become mentally ill. So I think I've heard, because of the pandemic, a lot of people suffer more out of fear, actually. So there's a huge mental component involved. So it's one thing to physically contract the virus, right? And it's another to be terrified. And that fear doesn't help the situation, right? Fear is part of delusion, right? Fear is related to delusion. So it's important not to be afraid. It's important to keep one's mind calm and to not take on an extra burden in the mind. So now, the Buddha advised the household of Nakulapita in this way. So even though your body gets sick, don't become mentally ill. So I heard in one district in Sri Lanka, a health officer spoke about how there are people who've been infected with the virus and they are staying at home rather than going to the hospital. And those patients are better off, this health officer said. Why? Because when people go to the hospital, well, I'm not telling you not to go to the hospital if that's necessary, but when people go to the hospital, they become afraid. They're in an environment that they're not used to. There are a lot of sick people around them. So they become afraid. And they become mentally sick. Then the householder, Nakulapita, having delighted and rejoiced in the Blessed One's statement, rose from his seat, and having paid homage to the Blessed One, keeping him on his right, he approached the Venerable Sariputta. Having paid homage to the Venerable Sariputta, he sat down to one side, and the Venerable Sariputta then said to him, Householder, your faculties are serene. Your facial complexion is pure and bright. Did you get to hear a Dhamma talk today in the presence of the Blessed One? Why not, Venerable Sir? Just now I was anointed by the Blessed One with the ambrosia of a Dhamma talk. So we can see here actually, so we should try to practice this the way the householder Nakulapita, he became very happy hearing the Dhamma. A very short Dhamma teaching that the Buddha gave about not being, about the nature of the body, that is subject to illness. And then Buddha advised him, even though you get sick in body, don't become mentally ill. So just that alone, he became very happy. He was elated. His facial complexion became pure and bright. His sense faculties were serene, subdued, peaceful. So we should also try to practice in such a way that when we hear the Dhamma, when we read discourses, when we listen to Dhamma talks, we should also try to take that Dhamma to heart, and we should also become peaceful in mind, happy in mind. That's something we should try to practice. To be able to be happy with the wholesome, to be able to gain happiness from hearing the Dhamma. So the householder Nakulapita was skilled in this. And then the Venerable Sariputta asks, with what kind of ambrosia of a Dhamma talk did the Blessed One anoint you, householder? And then the householder Nakulapita repeats the entire conversation he had with the Buddha about bodily sickness and mental sickness. It was with the ambrosia of such a Dhamma talk, Venerable Sir, that the Blessed One anointed me. Now this is interesting, the next sentence, what Venerable Sariputta explains. Didn't it occur to you, householder, to question the Blessed One further as to how one is afflicted in body and afflicted in mind, and how one is afflicted in body but not afflicted in mind? So this is important. The Buddha gave a short Dhamma teaching to the householder Nakulapita, and after that he left. But he wasn't able to ask in detail, so how to practice this. So it's important for all of you, when you listen to the Dhamma, when you engage in activities with the monastery and monks, to think wisely, try to understand, devote your whole mind to listening to the Dhamma, and any points that are unclear to you, at that very moment you should ask, not later. And here, so we have to be wise to be able to do this. So a monk can give advice, and we may not understand how to practice that. We understand the advice, but not actually how to implement it in our life. So at that moment, we should have the wisdom, wise consideration, to be able to ask, question, how should I apply this Bhante in my life? How should we understand this in detail? So then, look at the household of Nakulapita's respect for the Dhamma now. We would come from far away, Venerable Sir, to learn the meaning of this statement from the Venerable Sariputta. It would be good indeed if the Venerable Sariputta would clear up the meaning of this statement. So that question is so valuable. The question is, so how is one bodily and mentally sick? And how is one bodily sick but not mentally ill? That's a very valuable question. And the household of Nakulapita understands the value of that question. He's saying we would come from very far away to learn the answer to that question. It's worth coming from far away, worth traveling for long distance to learn the answer to that question. So when we listen to the Dhamma, when we participate in the Sutta class, it shouldn't become just a habit that something we do every, so what, it's Friday for all of you, right? Something we do every Friday night, we participate in the Sutta class. It shouldn't become just a habitual thing in our schedule, but we should understand really the value of what we're doing. This is a very rare opportunity, a very special opportunity. Amidst all the troubles in the world today, to get the opportunity to listen to the Buddha's teaching, the enlightened being's teaching, as applicable to our own lives, teaching that leads to the end of suffering, the biggest problem in our life, is a very special opportunity. We can forget that because we are in the middle of it, right? We've learned the Dhamma for a long time, gone for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, been lay Buddhists for a long time. So it's possible to forget that value because we're in the middle of it. But it's important to reflect in such a way that we really understand and appreciate the value of what we have. So some people, if you don't know English or Sinhala, I think there are few languages really where you can learn the Buddha's teaching clearly. Some languages I don't even think the Buddha's teaching have been translated into. So those people in various countries, if they don't know a language that the Buddha's teachings are taught in, they have no chance to learn the teachings, even if they want to, right? We are very fortunate. Then listen and attend closely, householder. I will speak. Yes, Venerable Sir, the householder Nakulapita replied. So before we begin the explanatory section of the discourse, does anyone have any questions as it is? Any comments on what we discussed? Anything to add? I'd like to have more of a discussion today if possible. I think that's valuable for everyone. Nothing to add? Okay, well then we'll continue for now. How, householder, is one afflicted in body and afflicted in mind? Here, householder, the uninstructed worldling, who is not a seer of the noble ones, and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, who is not a seer of superior persons, and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. He lives obsessed by the notions, I am form is mine. As he lives obsessed by these notions, that form of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of form, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. So what's happening? So in Sakkaya Ditthi, the view of a self, there are 20 ways that a person can have the notion of a self, have the view of a self. So in relation to the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, one can regard the aggregate itself as myself, or the aggregate is, so the self possesses the aggregate, where the self is made up of that aggregate, form in this case. Or form is inside of the self, or the self is inside of form. So these are the 4 basic ways that it would apply to all of the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. Now I want to ask you, can anyone, you can either speak or type your answer. So what are the 5 aggregates affected by clinging?
Hi, Bante.
Yes, Ray.
Form, feeling, perception, volitational formations, and consciousness.
Yes, very good.
So, Bante, I have a question about that.
Yes, Ray.
So, consciousness and is like a magician's trick. So, when I think of a magician's trick, I think of a card trick. So, I know the trick wasn't real, but I still see it. So, when I think of consciousness of myself, I sort of see a little person behind my eyeballs who feels, smells, tastes, and everything like this. So I remind myself that that is not me, but I still think it's me.
Yeah.
So does an enlightened person not see that? Like, does an enlightened person see that little person behind their eyes, or they don't see that little person behind their eyes anymore?
That's a very good question. So for a stream enterer, well, let me first say about like your state. So it's possible to have an understanding of that, right? You conceptually understand that this is not me, the consciousness is not me. But that's a conceptual understanding. To gain a realization is something different, right? To directly experience the non-self nature of consciousness, something else. That's not just an understanding, it goes beyond understanding. So a stream enterer disciple, a Sotapanna disciple, has eradicated self-view. So they don't have the view of a self. View in the sense of like a conceptual framework that they've come up with about their self in relation to the world, philosophical view, a speculative view. So the 2 extremes would be the view of eternalism, the view of a permanent self that survives forever after death, or the view of a material self. This is like the predominant view in like scientific materialism today. So the view is that, so the body is a person's self, and at death, everything ends. There's no continuance after death. So that's the view of annihilationism. They're both extremes that in the Buddhist teaching fall under wrong view. So a stream enterer disciple doesn't have that conceptual view of a self, but they still experience the notion of a self. So there's still that lingering sense of a self that's experiencing things. But an arahant, a fully enlightened monk, fully enlightened being, doesn't even have the notion of I. It's called in Pali asmimana, the notion I am, I exist. There's no such notion for an arahant. So we can understand how profound that realization is. So an arahant understands every moment the arising and passing away of the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. So because they see that impermanence, they see the suffering of that. There's no permanent happiness to be found in the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. And because it is suffering, It is non-self. We can't control it as we wish. We can't have form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness, behave in such a way, behave in a different way. So when the body becomes sick, we can't, just by thinking, have the body become healthy. When the body ages, we can't, just by thinking, have the body become young. Right? When the body becomes sick, we can't have the notion, may the body not contract the coronavirus. It's not possible because the body is non-self. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Bhante.
There's another sutta you could write down. His answers this question in detail, a discourse called the Kamaka Sutta. I don't know if all of you have read that. That's a very important discourse. It shows the difference between so the Sakkaya Ditthi, the view of a self, and the notion of a self. So it's found in this in the Samyutta Nikaya, the same book, the Kanda Samyutta, and it's on the chapter of the elders, Kamaka. Let me write it down for you so you can find it. Or maybe if Arjuna or Linda knows. Okay, Dinil knows. Thank you. So you can all read that. I think that makes it even clearer probably than what I explained. There's a really beautiful simile in that discourse. Okay, so we went through the view of a self in relation to form. So can anyone explain to me what form is?
Oh, sorry,
Yes,
Bhante. Form, I think it's the four great elements: earth element, water, fire and wind, air element, and anything that derive from the four great elements.
Yes, that's correct. Does anyone know the condition for the arising of form? The cause?
Is it the four great elements, Bhante? No.
That's one answer, but another answer makes it, that's one
Desire
method.
is the desire, the
That's
light.
also true. That's also true. I'm looking for a different answer here. So the cause is food. Food. Yes. Yes, Prasad. So food. So if food is the cause, condition for form, when we say form, what are we referring to? The things we see? Do the tables and chairs exist because of food? No, right? So the body exists because of food. So in the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, the body is included under form. Do you understand that? Because the cause, the condition is food. So without food, the body will die. It won't exist. Will wither away. That's why famine is a problem for humanity. Otherwise, it's not a big problem, right? It's a problem because the body exists dependent on food. Without food, the body will die because the cause isn't there. And with the cessation of food, form ceases. Now, what is the path leading to the cessation of form? Can anyone tell me that?
Getting rid of tanha to food.
Yes. In terms of the Four Noble Truths, what is the path leading to the cessation of suffering?
Eightfold pathway.
Noble Eightfold Path, right? So, yes, Prasad.
in terms of food, when Tathagata explains, so in my opinion is this food is like a 4 types of food: Kabalinkara ahara, Pasa ahara, Manosanchetana, and Vijnana ahara. Those 4 he is referring. The reason for telling is Swaminatha that because in none of the suttas Buddha explains what this food is. He always says food is the cause for the Patavi Apo Tejo Vayu. And in one of suttas, that is Dutiya Bhikkhuni Sutta, it's a famous sutta. Anantero means nun who is because Nani is asking Anantero to come to meet him to get the sensual pleasure from Anantero. But Anantero identifies it and he says, Bhagini Ayankayo Ayankayo Ahara Sanidana. One of the reasons is Ahara Sanidana, Ahara Bhutan. And the second is Tanha Nidano, Tanha Jato. Then the third one is Manam Nidana, Manam Jato. Then the fourth one is what you call Maituna. The Maituna.
Yes.
These 4 things he explains, he uses these 4 things to tell that these are the reasons for the arise of Kaya, arise of the body. So when I compare this sutta and then the Sattatthana sutta from Tathagata, so it says that the food is the reason for the Patavi Apo Tejo Vayu. So the reason the food, the not only the eating food like a Kabalinkara ahara, and the others like those are what we talk now, like a tanha. It's not exactly the food, the attachment to the food.
We should understand that in different suttas, we find different pariyaya. So the Dhamma is explained from many different angles in different suttas. So one good way to understand that, if some of you have read the Kin Sukopama Sutta, the simile of the milk sap tree, that is very clear in that discourse how you can see something at different times in different ways. So the Buddha teaches the Dhamma in various ways, from various angles, using different methods. So one method, yes, craving is the origin of the body. Another method, the body is originated from parents. Through sexual intercourse, the body is born. So we should understand there are different methods. But when we say the body is originated from food, we should understand here simply the physical food that we eat that sustains the body. So if we don't get that food, the body doesn't have the condition to continue. And the way leading to the cessation of form is the Noble Eightfold Path. So the Noble Eightfold Path, by practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, one removes all craving, right? And then by removing all craving, there is no renewal of form in the future. There is no rebirth. There's no continuance in samsara for an arahant, right? So no new form arises in a future life. Now, let me ask another question. I'm trying to, I think this discussion and these questions will help polish everyone's knowledge of the Dhamma. So we learned 4 things. We learned the aggregate of form, the origin of the aggregate of form, the arising, the cessation, and the way leading to the cessation. So this is discussing the 4 noble truths, right? So the 5 aggregates affected by clinging are the ultimate referent of the Four Noble Truths. Sankitena Panchupadana Kanda Dukkha. In brief, the five aggregates affected by clinging are suffering. So when the Four Noble Truths are being discussed, the Noble Truth of suffering is the five aggregates affected by clinging. So that should be realized, that should be fully understood. And the origin of the five aggregates affected by clinging in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in that method, the Buddha explains craving, right? With the cessation of craving, cessation of suffering. And the way leading to the cessation of suffering is the Noble Eightfold Path. Now I think Ray wants to ask questions before I go on.
No, I'm fine, Bhante.
Oh,
For
okay.
now.
I see the microphone blinking or something. Okay, so
Oh,
let me ask a question. Why is form? So first, does everyone understand that form is impermanent? You understand that? So why is it impermanent? What is the reason that it is impermanent?
Is it because it's conditioned and subject to change?
It's conditioned, yes. So what does that mean, that it's conditioned? Do you explain in detail?
Because the form arises due to cause, due to some causes, then the form arises.
Yes, very good. So you can explain it in different ways, like we said. So food, craving, defilements. But because it arises because of a cause, then it is conditioned. Now, the characteristics of conditioned things, upadopanyayati, an arising is seen, vayopanyayati, a disappearance is seen, titassa anyatattam panyayati, a change in its existence is seen. So these are the characteristics, three characteristics of conditioned things. So these characteristics are visible in form. Now, so we spoke about form a bit. Now, when a person is obsessed by the notions, I am form is mine, because they have this view of self, right, in relation to form. When a person is obsessed by these notions, that form of his changes and alters. So the form changes. It changes because it's impermanent, right? With the change and alteration of form, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. Now I can tell you a story about this. One day I was in Colombo. I was taking part in a charity event where we went to the Colombo Eye Hospital and we were distributing rice porridge to patients in the eye hospital. So I came to one area and there was a young man sitting on the bed holding his eye, and I came to offer him some rice porridge and he didn't even look up, didn't make any effort to speak to me, didn't take notice at all. And I could tell he was very depressed. He was grasping his eye. He was a young man, maybe like 20 years old or something, maybe even younger. And so I don't know the details, he might have become blind in that eye through some accident. So he's very depressed. You can tell just looking at him. So what has happened to him actually? What has happened to him is this, what's being explained here in this discourse. So he's regarding the eye, we say simply, he's regarding the body as I, mine. And when that changes because of impermanence, when that changes, he thinks I am changing, right? My eye is now blind. I am blind in this eye. With the change and alteration of form, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. So he suffers, right? I think that's a good example. We can understand how this plays out in our experience. Now, the second aggregate affected by clinging. So the uninstructed worldling who doesn't know the Buddha's teaching, hasn't practiced the Buddha's teaching, regards feeling as self, or self as possessing feeling, or feeling as in self, or self as in feeling. He lives obsessed by the notions, I am feeling, feeling is mine. As he lives obsessed by these notions, that feeling of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of feeling, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. Now, can anyone tell me what feeling is? There are many different ways to answer. When we speak about the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, what does the Buddha describe as feeling?
So, there is a sensation of sukha, dukkha, and adukkha, asukha.
That's true. So in relation to the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, the Buddha describes it as 6 classes of feeling. So feeling born of eye contact, feeling born of ear contact, feeling born of nose contact, feeling born of tongue contact, feeling born of body contact, and feeling born of mind contact. And those feelings can be, as Prasad said, either pleasant, painful, or neutral. So when we see a form with the eye, pleasure can arise. When we see a different kind of form with the eye, displeasure can arise. It's like painful. It's not a happy experience to see that. Or when we see something, I think a good example, you can just look around the room that you're in. If you look at just a bare wall, you don't have a specific pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling, right? If you just look at a painted wall, probably a neutral feeling is arising. So through the 6 senses, feelings arise. Now, what is the condition for the arising of feeling? Can anyone tell me that?
What's it?
Yes, contact. Pali passa, contact. So what is contact? I'm asking a lot of questions because it's extremely important to have a very clear understanding of all of these things. What is contact? Can anyone explain?
So because others don't tell, that's why I don't telling it. The Tinna Sangati first, so the rise of the form, then the sensory base, and the consciousness together.
So it's the, Tinnan Sangati Passo, the meeting, the union of 3 things is contact. So the eye, a visible form, and eye consciousness, when they come together, those 3 things, that is called eye contact. When the ear, a sound, and ear consciousness come together, that's called ear contact. So it's the unification, the coming together of the internal sense bases, the external sense objects, and the corresponding consciousness. I said corresponding consciousness. Why? Because consciousness is impermanent. It's not a permanent thing that continues unbroken throughout our life. It arises at the 6 senses. That's a different consciousness arising at the 6 senses. Buddha used the simile of a fire. So you can light a fire with various kinds of fuel, right? You can light a fire with wood. You can light a fire with logs. You can light a fire with twigs. You can light a fire with grass. You can light a fire from trash. But they're all fire, right? But the fires are named differently depending on the fuel. So consciousness is identified in different ways depending on the condition for consciousness. Consciousness arises in dependence on the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So it's not one permanent consciousness, actually. That's the magician of consciousness. That's a very profound thing, actually. So the arising of feeling arises because of contact. Now, what is the cessation of feeling? How does feeling cease?
When contact ceases, feeling ceases.
Yes. And what is the path leading to the cessation of feeling? The Noble Eightfold Path, right? So he regards perception as self, or self as possessing perception, or perception as in self, or self as in perception. He lives obsessed by the notions, I am perception, perception is mine. As he lives obsessed by these notions, that perception of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of perception, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. So also in relation to perception, the Buddha explains perception in terms of 6 classes. So perception of forms, perception of visible forms, perception of sounds, perception of smells, perception of tastes, perception of tangible objects, and perception of mental phenomena. So the external sense objects that we experience, the perception of those is included in the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. And those perceptions arise because of contact. So when the eye, a visible form, and eye consciousness come together, there's contact, eye contact. And because of that eye contact, perception of visible forms arises. That perception is impermanent. The contact is impermanent. The eye is impermanent. The visible form is impermanent. Eye consciousness is impermanent. He regards volitional formations as self. So the thoughts that we think, the intentions that we think, or self as possessing volitional formations, or volitional formations as in self, or self as in volitional formations. He lives obsessed by the notions, I am volitional formations. Volitional formations are mine. So when an unenlightened person is thinking, you think, I am thinking. These are my thoughts, right? But those are impermanent, actually. As he lives obsessed by these notions, those volitional formations of his change and alter. With the change and alteration of volitional formations, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. Buddha also explained volitional formations as 6-fold, as volitions regarding forms, volitions regarding sounds, smells, tastes, tangible objects, mental phenomena. And these volitions, these intentions arise because of contact. And when contact changes, the volitional formations change. We can have thoughts about something we see, and then another moment, thoughts about something we hear, thoughts about something we smell. Volitional formations are changing, dependent on contact. And so they arise and cease dependent on contact, and the path leading to the complete cessation of volitional formations is the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, any questions before we continue? I just want to give the opportunity to ask questions. Yes, Prasad.
Can you explain, Swaminas, the difference between the Mano Sanchetana and Rupa Sanchetana or Saddha Sanchetana, Dhamma Sanchetana? So one of those six Chetanas are there, depending on the form, depending on the object. So regarding the object, and so there is in 4 kinds of ahara. Tathagata explains at the last one of those as Mano Sanchetana. So is all called Mano Sanchetana together, or it has a different meaning?
So there are two pariyaya, two different methods of explaining the Dhamma. So we should normally try to not mix them up. So when the Buddha teaches one method, for example, the 6 senses, that's one method. When the Buddha teaches the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, that's another method. When the Buddha teaches the 4 elements or the 6 elements, that's another method. Dependent origination is another method. We shouldn't mix them up because they're describing different things from different angles. So we can get confused, actually. That's something that I think people have a tendency to do. We should, so when you see a discourse of the Buddha, there's no, so the Buddha doesn't try to like make the connections between the different methods of exposition. If the Buddha's teaching the 5 aggregates affected by clinging, then that's the method for that discourse. Normally, right? So when we read different discourses, we try to make the connections between them. I think partly because this is the way we've been educated. So in our secular education, try to make the connections between everything. But it's good to keep them separate. So in the 4 ahara, the 4 nutriments, Mano Sanchetana, we can understand as karma. So Chetana, intention is karma. So the intention that we have, and then we act by body, speech, and mind. So that intention creates karma. So that is a nutriment for the continuance of samsara, right? For the prolonging of suffering, because with that karma as a condition, we will be reborn again. So the chetana that arises at the 6 senses, the intention, that's also karma. But we shouldn't make an effort to really like try to compare and like make them fit together, because they're 2 different methods of exposition that the Buddha teaches. So over time, after learning the Dhamma for a long time, after understanding the Dhamma well, we will be able to, we'll be able to put all the pieces together of the different methods. But it's good to keep them separate when we learn them. Now, let me, yes, Ray.
Okay, so if I have a sound, if a sound comes to me, it makes contact with me. From the contact, I get a feeling. From the feeling, I get a perception. And that perception is the feeling that, or the sound never had nothing when it came. It's me that gave that sound or form or whatever I choose it as a feeling, a good feeling, bad feeling, or whatever, and from there my perception. But that's me. That's not what the sound or whatever is. Is that correct?
Not quite. So we should understand. So all of this is happening actually without a self. So we are not controlling this when this is happening. So the ear, independence on the ear and a sound, ear consciousness arises. The meaning of the three is ear contact. And with that contact as a condition, with the contact as a cause, feeling, perception, and intention arise. So we are not controlling that now this is going to be a pleasant feeling. Now we're going to make this an unpleasant feeling. It's happening dependent on the contact. So it's the nature of the contact, actually. If, for example, what can we say? So I see there's a cat in the background in your
Yes.
house or apartment. So
Yeah.
if the cat comes up and sits on your lap and starts scratching you, a painful feeling would arise probably, right?
Correct.
Scratching your skin with its claws. So that's not something we
Yes.
can control and say, okay, now this is a painful feeling because I'm wanting it to be a painful feeling. Or if we eat some ice cream, this is a pleasant feeling because I want it to be pleasant. It's the nature of the contact, actually, to give rise to that kind of feeling. The discourse you can read in Samyutta Nikaya, it's called Rooted in Contact. That explains very clearly the nature of feeling and the context from which the feelings arise. So
Thank you, Bhante.
because we have this view of a self, we see the feeling as a self, we see the perception as a self. Thank you for the sutta link, Dinu. That's the problem. So that's the ignorance. That's the delusion. These things are actually selfless phenomena, impermanent selfless phenomena that arise because of conditions. So now in regard to consciousness, the uninstructed worldling regards consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. He lives obsessed by the notions, I am consciousness. Consciousness is mine. As he lives obsessed by these notions, that consciousness of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of consciousness, there arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. So again, this is Buddha's explaining here through all of this. Well, actually, the Venerable Sariputta is explaining the Buddha's short Dhamma teaching. So this is a way that a person is afflicted in body and afflicted in mind. So this person can become sick, become ill, but this person is regarding the five aggregates affected by clinging in terms of a self, as I, mine. So they are also afflicted in mind because of this self-view. So we should understand actually self-view as a mental illness. That's how we should regard it. Then the Venerable Sariputta explains the converse. So how is a person afflicted in body, but not afflicted in mind? Now, we said before in the beginning of the talk today, because of the pandemic, so it's possible for even people who've received the vaccine to become ill, right? To contract the virus. So it's possible for them to become bodily ill. But if a person contracts the virus, they become mentally ill too, if they regard form as self, if they regard feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self. Do you understand? So like I explained the example of the boy in the hospital. So something happened to his eye. He had some accident with his eye. But he's thinking in terms of a self. He's immersed in self-view. So he's not only afflicted in body, but he's also mentally afflicted. He mentally suffers. when the 5 aggregates affected by clinging change. So how is one afflicted in body but not afflicted in mind? Here, householder, the instructed noble disciple, who is a seer of the noble ones, and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, who is a seer of superior persons, and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, does not regard form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. He does not live obsessed by the notions, I am form is mine. As he lives unobsessed by these notions, that form of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of form, there do not arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. Why? Because when form is changing, he doesn't think, I am changing. What is changing is mine. So he doesn't have that view. He doesn't have the view of a self. So what we learned, how an uninstructed ordinary person thinks in terms of a self. Now an instructed noble disciple doesn't think in terms of self-view. So this is the origin for self-view and the way that self-view ceases. So to think, there are these 20 ways we describe, the 4 ways for each aggregate. To think in that way is how self-view arises. To not think in that way, to not think in terms of the self, is the way self-view ceases. He does not regard feeling as self, or self as possessing feeling, or feeling as in self, or self as in feeling. He does not live obsessed by the notions, I am feeling is mine. As he lives unobsessed by these notions, that feeling of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of feeling, there do not arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. So let me ask you what idea you might have. So we can't just make an aspiration not to think in this way, right? We can't just make the determination, okay, now I'm not going to think in terms of self-view. It doesn't work, right? So does anyone have any idea what is the proper way to practice contemplating the 5 aggregates affected by clinging? You could give multiple answers for this.
Bhante, would it be through investigation, through looking at it, through seeing feelings arising, seeing how they arise, watching them pass away? How others, when you have a smell, it arises, it passes away. So investigating everything.
Seeing the impermanence, right? You're contemplating impermanence. You can contemplate the impermanence of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. Now to do that, you need to understand what the aggregate is. That's why I asked you the question, what this is. And I asked you the question, what is the cause for the arising of the aggregate? How does it cease? What is the way leading to its cessation? So the Buddha explained the perception of impermanence, or even in the practice of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The Buddha explains, iti rupang iti rupasya samudayo, iti rupasya attangamo. So such is form. This is what form is. Iti rupasya samudayo. Such is the origin of form. This is how form arises. Iti rupasya attangamo. This is how form ceases. So you're contemplating conditionality, how form arises and ceases depending on conditions. So to do that, you need to know what the aggregate is. You need to know what the cause for its arising is. How does it cease? So you can practice this, and this would fall under Satipatthana, the practice of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, to contemplate in this way. He does not regard perception as self, or self as possessing perception, or perception as in self, or self as in perception. He does not live obsessed by the notions, I am perception, perception is mine. As he lives unobsessed by these notions, that perception of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of perception, there do not arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair, because he's not obsessed by the idea, perception is mine, I am perception. He does not regard volitional formations as self, or self as possessing volitional formations, or volitional formations as in self, or self as in volitional formations. He does not live obsessed by the notions, I am volitional formations. Volitional formations are mine. I am my thoughts, my intentions. My thoughts and my intentions are mine. As he lives unobsessed by these notions, those volitional formations of his change and alter. With the change and alteration of volitional formations, there do not arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. He does not regard consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. He does not live obsessed by the notions, I am consciousness, consciousness is mine. As he lives unobsessed by these notions, so his mind is not controlled, overwhelmed by these notions, that consciousness of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of consciousness, there do not arise in him sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. He doesn't suffer when the five aggregates affected by clinging change. So the person who regards them as self suffers when they change. Do you understand? It is in such a way, householder, that one is afflicted in body, but not afflicted in mind. So it's possible, so it will happen, the five aggregates will change. It's possible for us to get sick, right? To contract various kinds of diseases. But if that happens, one should practice so that one, even if one gets sick bodily, one doesn't get mentally ill. One does that by not regarding the five aggregates as self, or as self-possessing the aggregates as in the self, or the self as in the aggregates. This is what the Venerable Sariputta said. Elated, the householder Nakulapita delighted in the Venerable Sariputta's statement. So that's the end of the discourse. Now, let me ask you another question. So this discourse is about the five aggregates affected by clinging, and the Buddha describes that as part of the noble truth of suffering, right? Now, why are they suffering? Can anyone explain to me why? If they're included under the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering, how should we understand that? Why are the five aggregates affected by clinging and suffering? There's a reason.
Bhante, can I try? Is it because we cling to them and we crave for them and it becomes
No.
suffering? And no? Okay.
No, that would be the cause of suffering. The noble truth of the origin of suffering. But why actually are they suffering?
Because of the because of the distortion as Anitya you take as Nitya, and Asubha you take as Subha, and Dukkha you take as Sukha, and Anatta you take as Atta. So because of that distortion at the level of three levels, and Sanya, Chitta, and Ditti, those three levels, and So we cling to that. When it changes, then you feel sad.
Close. How about this? So, does anyone remember the discourse on the characteristic of non-self, Anattalakkana-sutta?
Bante, can I try again? I guess
Yeah.
I think it's because we cannot have it the way that we want. That's why it's suffering. We cannot control them, Bante.
That's why it's anatta. That's why it's
Yes.
non-self.
Yes.
But it's suffering because it's impermanent. Yadanichang tang dukkang. What is impermanent, that is suffering. That is why. So the Buddha explains in the Anattalakkhana Sutta, right? Rupang nichang va anichang vati. So is form permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering and subject to change, fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, I am this is myself? No, Venerable Sir. So whatever we would regard as a self is impermanent, and because it's impermanent, it is suffering. So actually we're considering suffering as a self. That's the problem. So another thing I wanted to mention, practically, so it's important when we can learn various discourses on the Dhamma, many different methods that the Dhamma is taught. We learn many points on the Dhamma, but it's important not to get confused when we learn this. We should try to keep things simple the way we're thinking. Otherwise, we can get mixed up after learning a lot of things. So let me ask you a simple question. So we learn this about the view of a self, how the view of a self ceases, how we don't regard things as a self, how a person is both bodily and mentally ill, how a person is only bodily ill. So what do we take away from this sutta? What do we need to practice actually? You can give a very simple answer to this. I just want to reiterate, so it's important not to get confused after learning a lot of Dhamma, trying to put all the pieces together. It's important to understand simply what one needs to do practically.
For me, Bhante, it would be just to try to identify the aggregates of clinging and to watch them arise and pass away as I investigate them throughout the day.
That's true. Yeah, that's a correct answer. Even more simply, very simple answer, we can give: practice the Noble Eightfold Path. Right?
But I don't think that's easy, Bhante. I don't think that practicing the Eightfold Path is something that's
difficult
easy.
thing to do in life. It's the most difficult thing to do in life, but it's a simple answer though.
That's true, yes.
Yeah, right? So under the Noble Eightfold Path, then of course there's right mindfulness, right? Where you're practicing the 4 foundations of mindfulness and contemplating the arising and passing away of the body, feelings, mental states, the mind, and various phenomena. Right, so what the answer you gave would be included under like practices 4 foundations of mindfulness.
Could I get an example of what I do, Bhante?
I think best not to speak personally.
Well, for me or whatever, I just look at, say, sadness, and instead of trying to go to somewhere to end that sadness, be it buy something or whatever, I try to investigate it now. I try to look at it as not myself. I just try to look at it and see why is this, and watch it and not try to avoid it.
We should try to investigate. So if we suffer for some reason, we should try to understand. So there's a cause for this suffering. We get depressed, sad. So we need to, what's important, so we learned all of this about the view of a self. So instead of thinking in terms of a view of self, we need to try and practice to think in terms of conditionality, to think in terms of cause and effects. It's not easy to do. It can take time and practice to get accustomed to that. But over time, the mind can get used to that thinking pattern. So to think in terms of, okay, so unhappiness arose. It's an unpleasant feeling, right? It's a painful feeling. Why did that arise? Because of contact. Maybe something happened earlier in the day, and then, so that feeling actually disappeared. Someone said something mean to us, and a painful feeling arose. But then afterward, when we keep thinking about it over and over again, now it's a painful feeling arising because of mind contact. Before, it was a painful feeling that arose because of ear contact. It's an impermanent feeling, actually. But we're sustaining the feeling by continuing to think about it. So the feeling is arising again and again. And we can think about it, some person's thinking about it in terms of the self. Oh, he blamed me. I didn't do anything wrong. All thinking in terms of a self, right? So we should try to practice to think in terms of conditionality. Now, if a person really understands this deeply, have any of you heard the Pali phrase? So we chant this in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first discourse of the Buddha. Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang sabbang tang nirodha dhammanti. So the Venerable Anya Kondanya, when he became a stream enter, after listening to the Buddha's first discourse, that is what he understood. He gained that realization. Yang kinchi samudaya dhamman sabbang tang nirodha dhammanti. Whatever is subject to origination, all is subject to cessation, which means, so whatever arises because of causes, because of conditions, when those causes and conditions cease, those arisen phenomena cease. So it's a deep insight into impermanence, actually. That's the same thing that the Wander Upatissa, before he ordained and became Arahant Sariputta, when he was the Wander Upatissa, and he heard Arahant Asaji's verse on the Dhamma, that's the same thing that he realized. He realized the impermanence of all conditioned things. The impermanence of the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. There's no self to be found within the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. There's impermanent phenomena that are arising and passing away. And because they're impermanent, they're suffering. Because they're suffering, it's not suitable to take them as a self. They can't be controlled the way we wish. But we wish them to be permanent sources of happiness for us, right? But that's not possible because they're impermanent. So practically, learning all of this, what we need to do is to practice the Noble Eightfold Path, to develop Sila, Samadhi, Panya, virtue, concentration, and wisdom. And we practice those to realize the 4 Noble Truths. What we learned today is actually part of the 4 Noble Truths, Noble Truth of Suffering. And actually, we discussed all 4 of the 4 Noble Truths today. Any questions?
Bhante, can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Bhante. Bhante, when we attain the first stage of enlightenment, the Sotapanna, we abandon that Sakkaya Ditthi, right, Bhante? But I still don't understand at what level though, Bhante. I think I heard Bhante said that it's conceptual at that point, because when we are Sotapanna, the conceit I am is still there, right, Bhante? The atta is still there. It's like the cloth, the smell of the cloth is still there. The cloth is clean, but the smell of the cow dung or the soap or whatever is still there. But I would like to understand, Bhante, at the first stage of enlightenment, at what level, how do we understand that we have already attained that, abandonment of the Sakkaya Ditthi, Bhante?
Can maybe Dinil, can you provide a link to the Khemaka Sutta for everyone? It's in Sangyutta Nikaya, Kanda Sangyutta, and it should be the Theravagga, the chapter on the elders. I think it's helpful for everyone to read that. That's where that simile you mentioned, Linda, is found. The simile of the cloth that still has the smell. So
yes,
from
Bhante.
that discourse, we can understand the difference between, as I remember, I think in that discourse, the Venerable Khemaka was a non-returner, a non-agami. So he had no view of a self. He had eliminated Sakkaya Ditthi, but that notion of a self, asmimana, that conceit I am, is still there. So as he's explaining that to other monks, he actually also realizes the Dhamma completely, and he becomes an Arahant at the end of the discourse. It's a really beautiful discourse, actually. We can understand a lot. It's very deep, too. So we should understand the stream enter doesn't have this 20-fold self-view. So they don't have a conceptual view of a self. But that notion is still there. So the stream enter doesn't fall into the views of eternalism or annihilationism. That's what's very special about the Buddha's teachings, actually. If we look in the world at the other religions, so the theistic religions in general fall into the view of eternalism, right? A view of an eternal soul. There's an eternal paradise in heaven after this life. That's what the theistic religions normally fall into. And then on the other side, you have materialism, scientific materialism, that believes that this is the only life. After this life, there's nothing. That's annihilationism. So that with that view, a person can reject all morality, right? If they reject the existence of karma, then there's no results of good and bad deeds. So they can behave in whatever way they want. They can do as many evil deeds as they want to make themselves happy. So that's a very dangerous view to hold. And it's wrong view, actually, the Buddha explains. So, but both are actually based on the view of a self. Both are conceptual views, speculative views, based on the view of a self. But the stream mentor has abandoned all those views. If you look at the Brahmajala Sutta, which is a very special and important discourse, it's the first discourse in the Sutta Pitaka, in the Digha Nikaya, where the Buddha explains 62 views, and they're all based on the view of a self. So the stream enter has abandoned all of those views by eradicating Sakkaya Ditthi, the first of the 10 fetters that keep us bound to samsara.
Bhante, so how does it happen? So is the stream enter, or is the person walking down the street and all of a sudden, boom, he becomes a stream enterer? Or is it through meditation all of a sudden? Or is it gradually over time? Like does it happen in a split second, or does it happen? Like, how does somebody all of a sudden become a stream mentor?
When you read the discourses in the Vinaya, a lot of people realized the Dhamma in the Buddha's time by listening to the teachings, actually. When they were listening to a discourse, they became a stream mentor. Or when monks were listening to the discourses, they became arahants. So it can happen too during meditation. Now we should understand, though, it is like a moment. It does happen at a certain time. There's a definite time when that realization dawns on a person. I remember there's a discourse when the Buddha advises the monks to always remember all their life where they were ordained as a monk, where they realized the Four Noble Truths, where they attained stream entry. So if you can remember the place, then surely there's a specific time when it happens, right? And then a monk should also always remember all his life when he became an arahant. So
But
there's a specific time, specific place when that happens.
so I've been told or taught when I meditate not to strive for anything, to just look at whatever my meditation object is. So when you meditate, you should not be striving to become a stream enterer, or should you be? Like,
We should have a goal in mind. So have you learned about Iddhipada? The basis for spiritual power?
no, I haven't.
Okay. So in that, so that's one of the 37 requisites of enlightenment that the Buddha teaches. So it's important to have a desire to progress in the path. Now, I remember I was asked a question once. A man from Germany came to a monastery in Sri Lanka to practice meditation, and he was confused about this. So it was confusing for him, like, how can you have desire? Like, how should you practice with a desire? Right? So if you have a desire to practice the path, to progress in the path, isn't that a fault because desire is the cause of suffering? So he was confused about this. And I remember even in one of the discourses, this question was raised. So let's understand it in this way. So, for example, Ray, do you live in the middle of Toronto, or do you live on the outskirts of the city?
Actually, I live in Winnipeg, on the outskirts of Winnipeg.
Winnipeg, okay. So you live in the outskirts of Winnipeg. So say you want to go to the inner city of Winnipeg. So you have a desire to do that, right?
Yes.
There's a desire there. Now, when you actually arrive in the inner city of Winnipeg, does that desire cease?
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yeah, I'm there.
So in
Yes.
this way, yeah, you've arrived at your destination. So in this way, we should understand that the desire to progress in the path, that desire leads to the cessation of desire. So you have to have a desire to remove craving, to actually remove it. Otherwise, how to make an effort in the path, right? But after making the effort, after having that desire, eventually, when that goal is achieved, the desire ceases. It's important to
Thank
have
you,
a
Monty.
goal
That
in
was
mind when practicing the path. We shouldn't get like, I think maybe what you were advised, you shouldn't like overly focus on that. Like when you sit down to meditate, I have to attain this, I have to do this. Thinking in that way can be a hindrance to you if you overthink it. But we should have some desire to progress in the path, surely. Otherwise, if you didn't have the desire to go to Winnipeg, would you ever go?
why would I go?
Why would you go?
I wouldn't go. Thank you, Monty.
Mhm. Any other questions? Yes, Prasad.
Did you find the Swaminath, the answer for my question I asked now 2 weeks ago?
The one about the 5 faculties?
Yes, yes.
I think we can understand that. I discussed with another monk on that. We can understand that in so when a monk becomes an arahant, when he attains parinibbana, the 5 faculties cease completely. I think we can understand in relation to Ajita Sutta. So with the cessation of consciousness, name and form ceases completely. So when an arahant attains parinibbana, the 5 aggregates completely cease without a remainder. So faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, whatever 5 faculties were there in that arahant, they cease completely when he attains parinibbana. I think that's the way to understand that question.
Sutta says, they become complete when they attain parinirvana. So
Well,
you talk about
they're complete when he becomes an arahant. But when he attains parinibbana, you can't speak about the faculties anymore.
how you mean the body, you mean the passing away of the body.
When an arahant passes away, you can't speak about the 5 faculties anymore.
Oh,
A good question that you asked.
I was also thinking about it, so and I thought it is this is the way I thought when Sri Mentor attains Samika Vimukti.
What is that word?
Samika Vimukti. There's no English word for that. Or it is in Bodhika Sutta, then Migasala Sutta, it talks about Samika Vimukti, when it's or beyond that, who attains time to time, they attain temporarily. It's like Animitta Cheto Vimukti, similar to that. So they attain there. So during that, they don't, it's utmost relaxation. It's like a nirvana, but not nirvana. But that's the way they feel nirvana, the stream enters. So I thought, that's the place they, because it says, the stream enterers, they see that, they passati. Passati means they experience it, rather than they thinking, like imagining of this what happens. So samudaya and attangame, they are seeing it, experiencing it. So that's why I thought, this way.
Well, I think that would be, so I think, or if you think about the attainment of the cessation of perception feeling, Nirodha Samapatti. So whatever ceases in that attainment, that's temporary, right? So sanya and vedana cease in that attainment, but it's temporary. They will arise again after that, after say an arahant arises from that meditative attainment. But with parinibbana, then sanya and vedana will cease without remainder, will cease completely, will not arise again, right?